All right, my good people, we have a strut assembly out of the car now. We're gonna cover how to dismantle or disassemble so we can take pretty much, I think, just our coil spring today. We have new spring pads and strut mounts and unbearings, so all that stuff will be new bump stop and new sleeve. Oftentimes you can reuse the spring pads, you can reuse the dust boot if it's still in good shape, the bellow. We have new ones. This one's not bad though. These are pretty decent hard plastic. They're not like some of the softer ones that you'll see like on BMWs that can kind of tend to tear. Regardless, keep in mind if you can, go ahead and replace everything while you're at it. You don't have to worry about it for the next 100,000 miles. Now, on the P3 chassis, there's a couple of things we want to note. One, the strut assembly goes in one way, of course. You want to make sure you got the proper side for the driver's side or passenger side, depending on what side you're doing. Pay attention to the location of the tab for the sway bar and link attachment. Pay attention to the location of the bracket for the soft line. On the back side, they're going to look a little bit different. This factory damper has a little tab. This is what kind of keys in between that split and the knuckle that we opened up earlier. Just as an example, on the Bilstein unit, everything is pretty much the same, except for the fin on the back. Instead of a tiny little tab, we get a whole fin. So still the same idea, just it might look a little bit different. Now, another thing we want to pay attention to is the alignment on the parts that we're going to be messing with over here. Volvo tends to align the bottom of the, or if you will, the top of the spring pad and bearing assembly. It's a two-piece unit that goes in with the spring pad. So one part of it's going to be fixed, the other one's going to do the rotating. So that's going to sit like this. This bottom tab, which is located right here on the old unit, we want to make a note of that and what its alignment is to the strut body. So in this case, with just looking roughly, this tab aligns with the tab on the bottom here. So when we assemble our new strut assembly, we want to make sure that we line everything up the same way. So an easy thing you can do to kind of keep yourself in track and remind yourself of how things go is use a pen and mark everything. So since we're using the coil spring, I'm going to mark the coil spring as well. But just for my own reference right now, that tab is going to be lined up with the coil spring right here. So when I assemble my new stuff using the old coil spring, I'll be able to line up the new tab on the new bearing. And just for ha-has, we can go ahead and line up the same marks on the bottom of the spring and the spring pad. Even though we're replacing the pad, we can still transfer the mark onto our new one. So again, that's going to look something like that. This is just extra insurance at this point, not super necessary, but it doesn't hurt. And then so we keep track of what we're lining up to. Here's just a little mark on the old tab. Now over on the Bilstein unit, we're just going to go ahead. Again, this is all going to serve as a reminder and insurance. We're just going to mark the fin. So we keep our eyes on the prize and we remember what exactly we're lining up to. So with that, we're going to go ahead and set this one over to the side. And we're going to work on compressing the spring on this one so we can take it apart and transfer that spring over. This is the part where I tell you if you are unable or you're uncomfortable in doing this process, take the money that you're saving from doing this DIY at home yourself and go to your local shop, someone that you trust that has a proper spring compressor tool, and have them disassemble your strut assemblies and assemble your new one for you. 50, 100 bucks, whatever it may cost, is worth doing versus risking it and either hurting yourself or hurting the car while doing this at home. But with that, let's get into it with the spring compressor. I'm going to go ahead. We have our plates lined up. I'm going to adjust the tool accordingly, and then we'll get it on the springs and clamp them down. That is more than enough. Now we're going to go ahead and take our pass-through socket set. One thing to keep in mind, the hardware sizes do change on these from the factory dampeners to the new Bilsteins. The lock nut on this one is an 18. The new one is a 19. So we have both sockets on the table ready to rock and roll. Make sure your 6mm hex is sitting all the way flush inside of the head of the strut here. You don't want to strip that or break it, and then you're going to be having a much harder time taking these apart. For those of you not taking these apart and just replacing the strut assembly, maybe you're building a new one from scratch, be sure to pay attention to the paint marks on the springs so you know which ones to order. And if you have trouble with it, reach out to our service team at service@fcpro.com with your VIN, and they can help you find the right springs for your vehicle. Now we can pull the strut top off. All right, now we have the strut top off. There's a couple things. I've marked the top portion of the bearing as well. That one lines up with the basic middle of the old top hat here and the circle. Another thing to note is these bearing assemblies also have an alignment dowel, and that's going to be this right here. This is going to make installing this so much easier. Again, all these paint marks are overkill, but it's just to kind of highlight what we're working with. And that alignment pin, in this case, is going to line up with this hole right there on our strut top. That's going to make sure that everything's facing the right direction when we put it together, along with the little tabs up front, which we've marked just for reference when we put our spring and everything else in. We're going to feed this in. There we go. You can see the tiny blue mark from our dowel that we painted in over here. It's not sitting in all the way. It's not an exact perfect fit. It's just a guide. So with that, that looks good. We're happy with how that fits. So that means that our strut top will be good to rock and roll. Moving along, we have the bump stop and the bellow, which we're just going to pull this out of here to show you how that looks. So you can see the top of the bump stop sometimes sits flush with the top of the bellow. This one's actually in pretty good shape. I don't know if these have been replaced or not. This car's over 200,000 miles, but these are all genuine Volvo parts. So if it has, good on the previous owner. But again, we're going to be replacing this because we have new parts. The bellow has two different ends to it. The thinner end, if you will, is going to face down towards the bottom. The wider end, like you see in the old one, has the bump stop in it. So, and by thinner, I mean this dual ridged spot versus the thinner ridged spot on the top. I'm going to pop our bump stop into it. This is kind of going to sit wherever it wants to. The bellow itself grips onto the bottom of the shaft. So once it's in there, it's kind of going to just hang out just like it is now. But we're not ready for you yet. So we're going to get rid of this, move this over, get that here. And then the last thing you can do with this old one is just compare how the old spring pad sits in here. Here's our old one, which we're not reusing, we're going to be replacing. So we're going to go ahead and just line up our new one to it so we can transfer over that blue mark. And again, this is overkill insurance, but it literally takes 2 seconds and it does not hurt to do. Okay. So again, this is just rough. We're just lining these up based on how they look. There's little nipples on the bottom that we're going to pull through to lock the spring perch in place. They go through the bottom of the spring perch here. All right, now we can go ahead and install our bellow. Take off your locking nut if you haven't done so already. A little washer. Now the bellow on the built-in unit doesn't have quite the same snug fit that it did on the factory damper. The factory one has this white collar on here. This isn't transferable. You can take it off of here, but it's not going to slip on the neck of the new one. So just keep that in mind. It's going to be fine. It's not going to go anywhere. But if you're looking for that same snug fit, it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to take the bump stop, feed that over the top. Then we can take our washer, put that back on. And feed our strut assembly in. Okay, for now everything's going to be kind of loose, but there is worth noting, even though we have our blue marks, the coil springs always have a butt that butt up to the inside of the old spring pad. So you can see here, there's a little shiny groove on the old spring pad. That's where that butt used to sit. So the same thing's going to happen on our new one. We don't have to worry about that too much until we start loosening up the spring compressor when we're lining everything up. All right. Then with that, we have our strut top with our bearing and our top spring perch. This one just goes over the neck like that. All right, with that, we're gonna take our bump stop. Now that keys into the bottom of the strut mount here. It's got a little ring on it that just keys in like this. And that kind of helps keep it from dancing around while we're installing it. If you did it the other way, where you've assembled it and it's already on the car, with it just loose around, it's not gonna hurt anything. When the strut completely compresses, it's still gonna be there and it's still gonna do its job. From there, we can take the bellow, and that clips on over the bottom of this as well. There's a couple little tabs that allow the bellow to clip in. And with that, now we have our bump stop and bellow assembled. This can go on the strut now, so let's go ahead and do that next. All right, so with that, I'm just gonna stand this up. Again, I'm sure I've mentioned this in the past or in other videos, but coil springs always have a little butt that kind of keys into the spring pads. Sometimes like the upper spring pad on this doesn't have one, so it can kind of go in however it wants. But for the lower one, in this case, it has one. So just make sure that lines up. And in our case, having that lined up also aligns the spring with the mark that I made on my spring pad, which is also lining up with the fin on the back of the strut. So again, it's not perfect as far as my marks go. I transferred them over, but it makes me know that everything is in line. So with that, I'm gonna get this top mount situated in here. You're gonna lose the view of the alignments for a little bit, but that's more for me now because I'm installing this so I can see what I'm doing. I'm gonna feed this on. So this is obviously moving because I'm moving everything around. By having this, you can see that I have all my lines lined up. As I loosen the spring compressor up, that's when I'm gonna really make sure that everything's lined up. But for now, we're gonna get our 19mm lock nut started by hand. We'll get it laid down again, tighten it up. 50 Newton meters is a torque spec for the 19. In this case, because we're using a pass-through socket set, it's a little bit hard to replicate that, but you can double check it once it's back in the car. But since it's only 50 Newton meters, I'm not too worried about going pretty snug by hand. With that, we're gonna go ahead and stand this up. I'm gonna make sure all my lines are appropriate. The butt of my spring is seated up against the bump stop, or the little bump on the actual spring perch down below. Get everything lined up nicely. I think I need to compress this just a bit more. All right, so again, keep in mind, everything's moving here, but like this, all our blue lines are nice and lined up. So my job now is gonna be to keep everything in line as I undo the spring compressor. All right, my good people, and that is what this should look like. We got the flat side facing the back towards our fin, everything's lined up. Let's hop back over to the XC70 and get this installed.